Everyone assumes the US-Iran standoff will continue the way it always has. Tensions rise, markets shake, leaders threaten, talks resume. Nothing fundamentally changes. It feels cyclical, predictable, almost routine. But the most dangerous crises in geopolitics are not the loudest ones. They are the ones that stretch for years, quietly tightening until the structure holding them together finally gives way. And if you look at the current standoff through the strategic lens of Kuan, it becomes clear that this confrontation is not stabilizing, it is hardening, it is compressing, and it may be approaching the point where it snaps. Lee never ran foreign policy in Washington or Tehran. He built modern Singapore, a small country sitting at one of the most critical maritime crossroads in the world. But his insights about power, geography, and systemic pressure apply far beyond Southeast Asia. Lee believed geography is permanent, identity is durable, and systems under sustained strain do not drift gently into resolution. They either reorganize or they fracture. The US-Iran standoff has not reorganized, which means the risk of fracture is rising. To understand why, you have to strip away the headlines. This is not just about uranium enrichment. It is not just about sanctions. It is not just about missile tests or proxy militias. It is about a structural collision between a global superpower and a strategically positioned regional power, layered over geography that magnifies every miscalculation. Start with the map. Iran sits at the center of the Persian Gulf. It borders Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Along its southern coast lies the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy choke points on Earth. A significant share of the world's oil exports passes through that narrow corridor. That fact alone guarantees that Iran cannot be ignored. Lee understood choke points instinctively. Singapore sits near the Strait of Malacca, another global artery. He built his country's strategy around that geography. When you sit astride a vital corridor, your importance is baked into the system. Iran sits astride a corridor too. But unlike Singapore, which embedded itself into the Western economic order, Iran defined itself in opposition to it. That difference changes everything. Because now the world's most powerful economy, the United States, must constantly manage friction at one of the world's most sensitive geographic points. Every flare-up in the Gulf moves markets. Every naval maneuver changes insurance costs. Every threat to shipping alters global energy pricing. No war is required. The tension itself is disruptive. That's the first layer of pressure. The second layer is identity. Since 1979, Iran's governing ideology has been rooted in resistance to American influence. That narrative is not rhetorical. It underpins domestic legitimacy. It shapes security policy. It limits how far leaders can bend without appearing weak internally. On the American side, Iran has been framed for decades as a destabilizing actor, a sponsor of regional militancy, an aspirant nuclear power, a threat to allies like Israel. This mutual distrust has calcified. Diplomacy happens, but trust does not grow. And without trust, agreements are tactical pauses, not structural resets. Lee believed that when adversaries are locked into opposing strategic identities, compromise becomes politically dangerous. Each side fears that concession will embolden the other, so negotiations become exercises in damage control rather than transformation. Now add nuclear capability to the mix. Iran views nuclear advancement, whether for deterrence or bargaining leverage, as insurance against regime collapse. It has watched other governments in the region fall after external intervention. From Tehran's perspective, strategic ambiguity creates security. From Washington's perspective, that same ambiguity creates instability. The United States cannot tolerate unchecked nuclear expansion. It would unsettle regional allies, potentially trigger proliferation, and undermine global norms. So sanctions tighten, Iran adapts, talks resume, deadlines pass. Each round produces incremental adjustments, but the core logic remains unchanged. Lee often warned that when the underlying incentives of a conflict remain intact, surface agreements cannot hold indefinitely. The US-Iran standoff is defined by incompatible strategic logics. Iran seeks regime survival and regional influence. The United States seeks containment of nuclear development and regional destabilization. Neither goal is irrational, but they intersect at friction points, and friction, sustained long enough, generates heat. Here's where the snap risk emerges. The United States possesses overwhelming conventional military power. It could strike infrastructure. It could degrade military assets. But a full-scale war with Iran would not be simple. It would not be surgical. It would not be contained. Iran's strategy is not built on conventional parity, It is built on asymmetry, missile capabilities, drone swarms, regional proxy networks, naval disruption tactics, and narrow waterways. It cannot defeat the United States head-on, but it can make escalation costly. And when escalation is costly enough, deterrence becomes mutual. So Washington calibrates carefully. Carrier strike groups patrol. Sanctions squeeze. Limited strikes occur. Back-channel diplomacy remains open. Iran calibrates too. Controlled provocations, measured escalation, strategic patience. Both sides operate in a narrow corridor between full war and full détente. That corridor is shrinking because over time, gray zone confrontation hardens systems. Each new sanction deepens economic strain inside Iran. Each new Iranian missile test deepens suspicion in Washington. Each regional clash involving Iranian-linked forces raises the stakes for American allies. Domestic politics in both countries compounds the pressure. Iran's leadership must manage economic strain, public unrest, and internal factional competition. Appearing weak externally risks strengthening hardliners internally. American leadership must manage voter sensitivity to energy prices, alliance credibility, and political narratives about strength. Neither side has unlimited room to maneuver. Lee believed that prolonged tension without resolution eventually narrows options. Moderates lose leverage. Hardliners gain influence. The political cost of compromise rises. That's when systems become brittle. The snap does not require deliberate war planning. It can come from miscalculation. A naval incident in the Gulf that escalates faster than intended. A proxy strike that kills more than expected. A retaliatory response that crosses an informal red line. A sudden internal crisis in Iran that shifts decision-making unpredictably. When tension is high and margins are thin, even minor incidents can cascade. This is what makes the current moment dangerous. The US-Iran standoff is no longer flexible. It is rigid. Rigid systems do not bend easily. They crack. Lee would have asked a simple question. What is the equilibrium? Right now, there is no stable equilibrium. There is managed instability. That works until it doesn't. Energy markets are intertwined globally. Even temporary disruption in the Gulf affects inflation and domestic politics worldwide. Regional rivalries are layered on top of the standoff. Israel's security calculations are independent but connected. Gulf states balance deterrence with economic modernization. Iraq remains fragile. This is not a bilateral dispute. It is a regional web, and webs amplify shocks. Lee understood that once multiple systems overlap, geography, ideology, economics, regional rivalries, crises become nonlinear. Small triggers can produce large consequences. That is the snap risk. It is not inevitable tomorrow. But structurally, the ingredients are aligning. Pressure accumulation, rigid identities, shrinking diplomatic space, high-stakes geography, mutual deterrence without mutual trust. The longer these elements coexist without structural adjustment, the greater the probability of rupture. And here's the deeper danger. The United States is simultaneously managing strategic competition elsewhere. Its long-term focus is increasingly oriented toward Asia. Yet the Iran standoff demands constant attention. Carrier deployments, intelligence resources, diplomatic engagement, sanctions enforcement. Iran does not need to defeat the United States to complicate its strategy. It only needs to remain unresolved. Lee warned that great powers weaken when they allow peripheral entanglements to consume disproportionate energy. Iran may not be America's largest rival, but it is one of its most persistent strategic drains. The snap, if it comes, would not simply be a regional event. It would ripple through global markets, alliances, and domestic politics. And once escalation momentum builds, de-escalation becomes politically costly. Leaders fear appearing weak. Allies demand reassurance. Retaliation cycles accelerate. Lee believed that clarity prevents escalation, clear red lines, clear communication, clear incentive alignment. Right now, red lines are ambiguous, signals are layered, incentives are misaligned. The architecture of the standoff is strained, and strained architectures eventually fail. The US-Iran confrontation is not frozen. It is elastic, and elasticity has limits. When those limits are reached, the system doesn't gradually unwind. It snaps. Not because anyone wanted catastrophe, but because accumulated pressure overcame structural flexibility. Lee Kuan Yew's warning would not be about imminent war. It would be about structural brittleness, about recognizing when tension management has replaced strategic resolution, about understanding that geography cannot be removed, identity cannot be erased, and deterrence without trust is inherently unstable. Right now, the US-Iran standoff is stretched across one of the world's most sensitive choke points, layered over ideological rigidity, reinforced by asymmetric deterrence and pressured by domestic politics on both sides. That is not a stable design. It is a system under strain. And systems under strain do not remain balanced indefinitely. They either reorganize through bold structural change, or they fracture through sudden escalation. The uncomfortable truth is that neither side has yet demonstrated the willingness or capacity to engineer that structural change, which means the pressure continues to build. And when pressure builds inside rigid systems, history rarely moves slowly. It moves suddenly. That is the real warning. Not about headlines, not about one negotiation round, but about a standoff that has stretched long enough to become brittle, and brittle systems eventually snap.